G'day again from Frontlines and Faultlines, and today we have the opportunity to go back and talk again with my good friend Mick May from Synergy Group on these really important critical issues that are front and centre really of our strategic management of the current circumstances we find ourselves in, and as Mick talked about last time, disaster response as well, and dealing with pandemics. So there's a lot of things we need to tease out in the context of those subject matter areas. So we're very fortunate to have Mick back with us again and really continue that conversation. So thanks for coming back again, Mick. And
pleased to be back.
Yep, and really appreciate your comments last time. And you surfaced a few things there. One is like the budgetary issue. And I think back to during World War II, I think we hit 140% of GDP in debt. And then you talked about that long-term management of those things. So we'll come back and talk about that. But also you mentioned the fly in, fly out issue and how we manage surges there and encampments for supporting activities and the flexibility around that. One thing that struck me with the pandemic was, in China, in Wuhan, they threw up a new hospital in 10 days. And we had this wonderful opportunity with our landscape and our ANC gap and space to do something like we did at Howard Springs, but on a larger scale in a way that could have been modular. And instead, we went with this hotel quarantining situation, which failed. And so it seemed to me that one of the best way forward to being prepared for these things, because the Commonwealth gave away a lot of its quarantine land as well from the old 19th century and 20th century constructs, is to have, the ability to scale up a Howard Springs at short notice to manage all of your returnees coming back and quarantining to give you that buffer breathing space you need. So what are your thoughts on, how do we manage this, descaling and upscaling, and particularly you mentioned the small and medium enterprises. How do we deal with their vulnerability to contracting peaks and troughs nationally?
Right. So if the circumstances existed where we had a major movement of US forces into the Northern Australia, I mean, we've both worked closely in coalition with the Americans. I can remember, Kandahar, for example, 65,000 on that base.
Right.
I think 25,000 of those were contractors or something like that.
Right.
The scale is huge, and I joke with people, particularly in Melbourne and Sydney, good luck getting a plumber if your toilet's blocked, if the Americans move into Northern Australia in numbers, because all the tradies, the clever ones, will get in their twin cabs and they'll motor up and get a bit of US money. Because we know that man workforce is a huge issue. I've had the privilege to have gone right across Northern Australia over the last 18 months, from Pilbara Gascoyne right through to North Queensland, far North Queensland, talking to state and territory governments, and also talking to local leadership, not just those that run the towns, but also those that run the key institutions, key infrastructure, traditional owners, etc. And I was only recently up in Longreach for a family wedding, and it just reinforced to me that that Northern Australia is the workforce is an international workforce.
Right.
The people that are helping make Northern Australia run are not Australians.
Okay.
Because Australians, there's plenty of work going on for them in the southeast and in other population centres.
And hard to get them to live outside the cities.
Yeah, right. So getting just the workforce necessary to respond to Northern Australia. Now that workforce will move where the work is, there are some parts of Northern Australia that are challenged: housing, water, power, sewerage, etc., because their economies just aren't growing enough to be able to support the investment that comes with stronger, more diversified economies. But there's parts of Northern Australia that they're only the absence of a major industry away from being seriously depressed,
Right.
and or they're only a major industry away from being a really sustainable, diversified economy.
Right.
That starts to attract more people. People don't have to go away to get educated. They get educated in location. They may go away for the first 10 years of their career, but they do return when they've got kids, and they build a lifestyle and they build business there.
And life cycles.
And that becomes your sustainable rump of capability that you can then draw capacity from. So one of my criticisms, and this will be probably decried from the high church of defence thinking, and probably highly applauded from elements of the Australian economy that are feeling vulnerable, is that if you look at force posture, defence force posture, and how the economy actually functions, they're not on different planets, but they're 180 degrees apart.
Right.
Where our key centres of economic activity are, defence invariably isn't, and if it is there, it's in small numbers.
Right.
So, one of the mistakes that I find that military planners make is that they're a bit binary in their thinking. So the circumstances that would drive conflict in our region would be such that the economy would stop, and therefore resources would immediately become available. Now that might be true if you needed to close down the tourism industry in North Queensland. Increasingly less so, because that tourism industry is also accommodating fly in, fly out workers internationally. But we know from history that, to our earlier discussion about the importance of the economy, that your economy, even in the Ukraine, has to function at best pace in adverse circumstances to be able to make the country function.
Right.
So the country has to function, has to continue to function. So the separation between defence planning and whole of government, whole of nation planning has to be resolved as a priority and resolved in advance. And the level of common understanding that can be developed through that approach will ease the wheels of industry really, really quickly. Okay, so there's this real reticence, well, it is a real reticence for defence to actually talk openly with industry, particularly industry that's not necessarily contracted already to defence, and have really open and frank discussions with them, and an admission that defence is not going to be able to solve this problem by itself. Like the National Defence Strategy tells us that it can't. Any thumbnail dipped in tar calculations on the back of a fag packet about how much of defence would need to be committed should the circumstances exist that would require mobilisation, tells you straight away that defence doesn't have much room to move before it has to lean really heavily on the national support base, and not just in a tactical sense. You know, we certainly got an indication of that with Interfet through Darwin. You know,
logistics and
so to highlight that point, you know, unless there, if there hadn't have been an initiative for Army's presence in the north that developed one brigade or sent one brigade kicking and screaming to northern Australia and developed the infrastructure around that, then you would have had to have questioned our ability to actually support Interfet. Interfet probably would have been a much different operation if we hadn't have pre-invested. And you know, we do have bases across the north, but most of the investment at the moment is going to places like the Northern Territory, states like Queensland. They've got, they are certainly up there in Australia in terms of defence presence, not just serving people, but also ex-serving people. But in terms of how much is being invested into Queensland, then it doesn't match what's being invested into places. So my point there is that, you know, there is a delimitation to the amount of money that's being passed out, and where it's being invested, which just heightens, the point that I made before about this, what false posture do we need, and what how does the economy function? You know, how survivable in a conflict how hard would we have to fight to sustain a secure Northern Territory, for example,
and whether that's even feasible or desirable when you talk about, and in World War II, of course, you know, the preserve the industrial base in the far southeast, well out of harm's way from strategic bombing, etc. But and the logistic and supply nightmare an invading force would have had to deal with in that vast open northern space.
The technology's changed.
Yes,
in terms of reach.
Shrunk in those spaces. And
you just look at data alone. We have contemplated, the path to disaster for Australia in one of the activities we're involved with. I facetiously said, well, Australia would only stop to function if both Melbourne and Sydney had been blasted, which Canberra people didn't tend to like, but but I think that if the government can't guarantee resilient and secure data, both to Australia and across and through Australia, then it's not going to be a government for very long. And who's actually addressing that issue? There's certainly investment going there, but is there sufficient investment to address a conflict environment where it's not easy? It's not hard to imagine that China would seek to deny Australia's participation, or at least make sure that we were completely disinterested or disabled and not able to contribute.
Yeah, a critical point, and it comes back to your point too about the bureaucracy and the lack of digital literacy and technological literacy amongst policymakers and politicians at times, but the senior leadership and the bureaucracy really struggles with it too. And in what answers do they provide to these things? The decisions made around procurement and their inabilities to even evaluate or run competitive processes around that, and that comes back to your point about the industrial engagement, and how the US has actually had long-standing practice of that deep and enduring conversations with industry about how you construct that national capability and resilience, going back to the days of the arsenal of democracy and all that. And that seems to be a cultural problem that we have in not wanting to engage with industry. But also, it'd be interesting to get your comments on this, is I see that industrial dimension as part of your deterrence posture.
Right.
And if you look at what drove, Hitler to launch World War II when he did, he started to see, Britain and its industrial capacity and production and capability, was going to rise to a point where he thought that this is now the time to strike, where we've got a lead on that. And if we could maintain deterrence in modern contexts, such as, well, say that if the threat's China and they can dominate us in space for a period of time where they get the advantages they need to get the jump to do what they want, then how do we contribute to the industrial and capability deterrence in that context, etc., like having more launch sites in Australia or dual use sites.
Right. So in terms of getting securing and maintaining access to space in the GMT +8 ±2 hours,
right,
and also reach down into the Antarctic, which is not easy to do from geosynchronous sort of orbit.
right.
Australia's in the prime seat to do that. One of the reasons that the US became the arsenal for democracy was because strategically it worked well for them to mobilise their industry to support the defence of Great Britain,
right,
and to provide support to Russia because of the political issues they were having with isolationism, etc., and the very careful political path they had to tread to before they joined the war. And then, of course, once they got into it, So Australia, historically, we effectively fought two wars in World War II. One was in response to Great Britain and the Empire as an element of the imperial forces, much to our disappointment. It cost us a division in the bag. Aside from the blood and treasure we invested into, Syria and North Africa. And it wasn't really until 42, 43 that we faced that existential crisis, and we got serious about it. Now we were very fortunate that we'd had that sort of initial phase, but that initial phase wasn't industrialisation to support the empire. It was sending forces. The British Empire flying scheme, the divisions that we sent across.
How we resupply our own troops.
That sort of stuff. So, we don't have that connection, that strong connection with the industrial base. And defence investment certainly doesn't drive economic decisions in Australia. If you actually look at what defence really, really, really needs, once you get past the ships, planes, tanks, guns, that type of thing, it actually needs workforce, industry, infrastructure, critical material.
Right.
It needs, you can't say we're going to solve the strategic material distribution problem by contracting it out, because you are then directly competing with the supply chain that makes Australia tick. So how do you actually do that? The tourism industry only delivers part of it, but how do you actually do that in a serious way? So that needs investment. Now, investment, ports, in particular, and there needs to be a strategic narrative
Right.
associated with, ports,
Right.
airports, roads,
Right.
and the infrastructure that supports that. There needs to be a strategic narrative, like a proper strategic narrative around industry, a particularly dual purpose, dual use industry. So you don't need to have great scads of people producing explosives, but you do need to have an effective, robust, and sustainable chemical industry, that can actually do that. You can, there's the remote and rural parts of Australia run on air. But interestingly, I was sitting down, catching up with a relative who runs part of the air industry in rural remote Queensland. And just during the last election, in combination with the heavy rains and the flooding, and the response that's needed to provide stability from an emergency response perspective, they were tapping out, and they were drawing on all sorts of resources to keep the country functioning. Now, but if you're going to start to put in airstrips and aprons, then you need to look at asphalt batching plants, and you need to have a secure source of sweet sour crude to do that. Now
the energy security side of
it's very much a strategic perspective. Now, my observation is that people are attracted to the Finnish solution or the Swedish solution, where the industrial base is hardwired in to the fabric of both the political and economic fabric of the country. But that's been done because they've taken hard hits. They've had, and they live with existential threat, and that's particularly the case now. So they made that choice a long time ago. We didn't make that choice, and we didn't need to make that choice a long time ago. So the question would be now, when do we make that choice, and how much are we prepared to invest in the serious modernisation of national infrastructure and the development of that, the core capabilities, and that critical mass of capabilities that we need from not just a defence perspective, but from a national security perspective.
And some serious plans around that. I think one experiment we could conduct with this, to me, is, we've run into this issue with war in the Ukraine, about how to, maybe establish a coalition of the willing that can deal with these issues around the US sort of fluctuations at the moment. And one opportunity there and challenge is that, and to the credit of one step forward of the thinking that we've made, is that we've got to bring back our capability to do some of the standoff weaponry capability here, etc. And so we're going to begin production of 155 millimeter rounds per hour. The interesting thing there is that the original concept is that it will produce 10,000 rounds a year, with the potential emergency capacity to ramp up to 100,000 rounds. And at the moment, you've got the Ukrainians having at peaks and troughs, obviously, but at times having to let off about 5,000 rounds a day against a volumetric threat. So, our contribution to deterrence to the Russians and others would be to ramp up that capacity now and test that out and supply that to Ukraine in that fight. Because they're worth their weight in gold, 155 millimeter rounds at the moment, a premium product at the moment in the world. But the interesting thing is those rounds are going to be made under a license from the US. It's a US round. And what if the US says no? We're not going to allow you to move that off to a third destination.
And we had that. We had that experience in Vietnam.
Many.
These are real issues that need to be addressed. One of the benefits of even though I don't doubt that Trump's administration's, I don't doubt the importance of the Pacific to the Trump administration, or its willingness to support Australia. But hope's not a method. You actually have to plan with a degree of certainty, particularly if you know that your level of preparedness is probably less than optimal, and that the initiative doesn't rest with you. So you need to you need to have sufficient resilience to take some really big blows, and then respond and mobilise, because almost all of your immediate capability will be absorbed in the response.
Yep.
How much capacity do you actually have? I do joke with the ADF to say, historically, the armies that start the war aren't the armies that finish it.
Yes.
Okay? Yeah. And I'm not saying that, you're all dead on the battlefield, but they are fundamentally different armies. You World War I, World War II, et cetera, et cetera.
And some of these precision-guided munitions too. I mean, Ukraine, they've run through 7 years' worth of a production line for a thing like a Stinger or whatever, So
yeah,
that.
So the cost and the scale. I think the Ukraine, last time I looked at $1 trillion, just if the war was to stop and they were left alone to reconstruct things, $1 million, $1 trillion worth of damage or thereabouts. The costs are staggering. To your earlier point about the cost of World War II at its peak, 65 cents in every dollar, pounds in those days, of Commonwealth money was being spent on the mobilisation effort.
Right.
If you bring that forward into the current era and you look at the amount being spent in the Ukraine, that would be equivalent to spending our current defence budget every 2 months. So that's $6.2 billion that was spent in 6 weeks during COVID.
Yeah.
Not even within cooey of that.
Yep.
And it means that the machinery of government has to fundamentally change.
Right.
And that's a difficult beast to move. So
you have to have those conversations, right?
You have to have those conversations, and egos need to be parked,
right,
etc. But if you look to the US experience during World War II, there's a few fundamentals, and you look to our history as well. There's a few fundamentals that people must keep in mind, and the first one is that politics doesn't retire during conflict, and in fact, conflict exacerbates politics. So even though they do talk about war cabinets and collaboration and all that sort of stuff, it becomes a serious stand 'em up, knock 'em down fight politically, and it's not just from a federal perspective. So this emergency powers give you a lot of freedom of action, but constitutionally you still have to mobilise through the states and territories. Yeah. So the level of collaboration and cooperation that's required is profound, and the demand, as we've already sort of intimated at, will fall very unevenly across Australia. So there'll be parts of Australia that will effectively be at a war footing that may well have to be under some form of joint interagency control that will still be seeking to function at best pace economically, that will still have elections and referendums, all of this sort of stuff. When you're talking about national defence, needs to be incorporated. So getting talking through those issues in advance and building something more than just a government crisis management framework, even though it's an all hazards type, all threat design, but actually exercising the hell out of that in a very serious way, past the point where deterrence has failed, which is politically sensitive because that's what the National Defence Strategy rests its laurels on. Deterrence working,
which we all need to
and that's
prioritise,
difficult. So and then early injects of money if the government decides to ramp up spending to 3% of GDP and do so immediately. London to a brick. Bureaucracy will grab that money and spend it on itself, and then it'll spend it on existing contracts. And it won't do that in a way that acknowledges when that bureaucracy, what the failure point of that bureaucracy is, and what the failure point of existing contracts are. All right. And so this is what happened in Australia in World War II. They then made major changes to the bureaucracy that was governing mobilisation in Australia. They then realised that they had to contract dual use capability and technology towards the war effort. And that was done through the provision of contracts that had Commonwealth annexes to factories. So you can still continue doing what you do normally, but you had to go through the process of training, retooling, etc., to deliver on these war-associated contracts. And even then, when it got to 42, 43, and you read the cable that's on the war rooms down in Victoria Barracks in Melbourne, they still faced serious shortages in stuff that we currently acknowledge as shortages, and we're not even at war right now. So
it was interesting. They mobilised us to the position where we're able to field 11 divisions, and they realised we've got to demobilise them to get back to the factories. And but to your point too, though, I think that one of the keys then was you had a non-bureaucrat in Essington Lewis who really performed a central role in that. And so, it comes back to where we take the conversation now and look, the government would do well to draw on, all the deep study that you've done on this. And, I think they need to reach out to outside inputs from industry, et cetera, to really start putting a war book together, I guess, on all of these things. But also some of that's got to be public to send these strong signals of deterrence now to try and avoid all that. But, there's so much richness in the things that we've covered that I'm really looking forward to taking particular components of that and teasing them out in the future. And I think hopefully that we can perform that role of creating a space where we can get the bureaucracy and others engaged in that conversation and really start to try and then produce, the basis for strategies and plans around that in the future. So, I'm really grateful for the effort that you've put in and the thought that you've put into this, because it's critical now more than ever, and just need to wake up political and secretarial leadership to really engage more broadly on this, and that will help the public conversation as well, I think. So, so thanks so much, Mick. Really appreciate you swinging by.
Great to catch up again.
The first of hopefully many in the future.
There's plenty to explore and talk about.
Totally. Yeah.
But it comes down to action at the end of the day.
Right.
So it's really not a case of when you start, the political decision will be made late.
Yeah.
People will want to retain a political freedom of action for as long as they can, and they'll do that, I'd reckon, to the detriment of defence preparedness. That's just politics. So it's a case of where you start. And then this really frank admission of what our capability is and what capacity does that have to scale, and have, the Essington Lewises in the room as a specific cabinet with the authorities of the Prime Minister, to actually cut through right down to the point of production, distribution,
Right.
workforce, those sort of critical issues that are going to make Australia respond in time.
Right. Oh, well, I look forward to us dealing with those issues in more detail. But thanks so much, Mick, for being with us across these two programs, and we'll be reaching out to you again. And look, thank you for chiming in and listening to this, and hopefully that you'll become part of those conversations as well, and whatever endeavour or field of activity that relates to these things, and it's just about everything. So we'll see you again next week, and thanks for chiming in. Cheers.